one of the best memes right now is George Russell. So that'll be our pivot and segue to Mercedes. We've mentioned the very critical comments, the bleak comments, the walls are caving in on us comments, and yet they put together P4 and P5. And I understand it's not to the standard that they are used to at Mercedes. I also like to take people for what they say and believe them as authentic, genuine human beings. I'm not saying that they're not a Mercedes, but it feels like they're painting a much darker picture than what their performance maybe would show on the grid. Like, are they trying to make us feel like things are in a worser place than they actually are?
I think it's all about perception, isn't it? I mean, there's so many teams on the grid that would be delighted to finish fourth and fifth, be close to a podium, not quite get it, or have it for an hour, or whatever George had. But that's not where Mercedes are coming from. They're coming from a team that was dominating, and it's not important where they are relative to Aston Martin and Ferrari, really. What's important to them is where they are relative to the front, and that's Red Bull. And that gap is huge. And it's the kind of gap that in any normal season, and I believe this will be the case this season, you cannot overturn. And that's what they've realized. And they've realized that they've got to change some fundamental things about their car. And that is a very worrying position to be in, because they did look at other ways of developing their car earlier in the year, and they kept coming back to the concept they have now. But now that has been proven that it's not enough. And in order to go down a different path, they're going to have to change some very fundamental things about the chassis, things like crash structures, stuff like that, which you cannot change in a single season without breaching the cost cap in reality. So they're stuck trying to turn this current car into something else, whilst knowing that actually for next year they're going to have to be working on something different again. So it's almost how lost they are, which is the issue, not necessarily just, where they're finishing on the track. It's how far off they are Red Bull and how long it's going to take to get back. And I think that's why they are understandably upset about it. But there's only so much time you can spend being upset, and then you've got to start finding solutions. And I think that's the messaging that's starting to come out of the team now, is that, we're working towards solutions. We've got stuff coming that will help this year's car, and then we've got a good idea of where we're going for next year's car, and trying to build that understanding. So that's where they are. But I think they're absolutely right to be disappointed in themselves, because they're not where they should be. A team with that budget, that history.
I agree with Lawrence. It is a bit of a Totoism, though, isn't it? Even when they were winning, he would kind of, if they qualified, second and fourth, the quotes you'd get on the Saturday would be, "This is a disaster. We need to go back to the drawing board." And they'd win the race 1-2 by 30 seconds, and then the next day. And I think it does come down to the mindset. But again, to Tony's point, it does make it it's kind of very memeable when you go from one extreme to the other very, very quickly. At least in the perception of that is that. But I think it does come down to that mentality of, we need to be the best, and nothing else comes close. And I think that Red Bull and Mercedes are probably the only two teams on the grid that legitimately have that mindset. And I think it shows in how they deal with a lot of these things.
I've always wondered, what's that mind frame that you need when you've built this car and it's, tens of thousands of pieces, and you're like, okay, which one do we need to swap out? Because the endless combinations you can be, and it's not as simple as just where it's very obvious what are the 2-3 parts we have to swap out. But I've always wondered, what is that game at which point you go, right, the car's not working, we have to scrap the design, we have to scrap the concept and start again. Or whether we try, and which is where they are right now, they've been trying and tweaking and changing the concept that they have, and to Lawrence's point, now they've realized this concept isn't working, we have to change. But I've always wondered what that looks like, of just looking at the car and going, right, what are the hundreds of pieces that we're actually having to swap out, which ones are we keeping, and what combination of that is, because it's a mental, for me anyway, someone who doesn't work in car design, to have to think about that. Okay, great, let's look at all the parts and what we're swapping out, where are we pivoting.
It's like in a Rubiks Cube.
That's it. Yeah.
I feel like, can you get it perfect? And obviously it feels like Red Bull has. I just think that the comments that we've received from Mercedes, extremely dramatic, fine. They undersell, over deliver. And maybe that's a good place to be in at this moment in time. Nate, I think you said something interesting. Red Bull and Mercedes come from the same kind of mindset. Lawrence, how would you describe the mindset at Ferrari right now, based on what you saw on the weekend?
Yeah, I feel like Ferrari have been trying to kid themselves that everything is okay. That's the kind of messaging that they're getting, is that okay, things haven't worked out, but it's this and this, and because the car's quick over one lap, it means eventually we'll be okay. And in a way, I find that slightly more concerning because it doesn't look great from the outside what's going on at Ferrari. And it does feel like they're at the start of a period of a similar thing to where Mercedes are. Complete change. They've got people leaving the design office. They've had a change at the very top. And when you now look back to the start of this year, when Fred Vasseur, the new team principal, was doing his early media calls, and he was saying we're going into the season because we want to win the championship. That's our target. And you look at it now, and it just seems so far away. And that is slightly concerning, the disconnect between, I think, what obviously they should be fighting for, but the reality of how big an issue and to some extent how big a mess there is at Ferrari for Fred to get his head around. So I don't think that's going to be the work of a moment either.
Yeah, it's the Ferrari kind of, the ongoing saga with Ferrari is just quite depressing. And I do think that maybe, obviously we knew how bad things were last year, but I think that a lot of people had kidded themselves that maybe things looked worse last year because the strategy was going so bad and all these things. But actually maybe Ferrari just, started very, very well and actually just didn't have the race car that maybe, I mean, they definitely had a good race car at circuits, but I think maybe the fact they were making so many blunders in races detracted from the fact that actually, they're in a worse position in terms of on track than maybe we gave them credit for. Because as Lawrence said, Vasseur came into the season and was like, nope, we're back on track this year. Like we can take it to them, and they've just gone backwards.
It feels that way. And as you mentioned, Lawrence, at the beginning, I mean, Charles Leclerc put together a great start to the race. I mean, he, like Max, was picking people off. He was driving extremely well. Obviously, the safety car didn't bode well for them, but Carlos Sainz's performance, I think, was what stood out to me. Obviously, both of you picked him to be on podium in Saudi Arabia, and that was far from the case. Tony, what did you make of his drive?
Charles or Carlos's?
Carlos's.
This is really bad to say. I can't remember his drive.
Well,
I think that sums it up. Yeah.
Trying to rack my brain. No,
It was basically qualified fifth, finished fifth.
There you go.
And didn't really, his highlight of the race was being overtaken by Stroll in that really good move that Stroll put in. Or was that Charles? Again, I can't remember if that was Charles.
No, that was Carlos. That was a great move by Stroll around the outside at turn 13 early on. And then the other time Carlos got overtaken was by Lewis after the restart, because Lewis was then on mediums and Carlos was on hards. So I think
just forgettable.
Yeah, it is kind of forgettable. And he was talking about it afterwards, and he was clearly very, very downbeat about where Ferrari are in terms of looking after tyres in the race was the main concern. So it seems to be a case that car does just chew through its tyres, especially in Carlos's hands, maybe more so than Charles. And then also he said that when they're running in traffic, they really struggle. So that car appears to be quite sensitive aerodynamically when it's running in the wake of another car, which then has the impact on tyre management, which then means it's very hard to advance further. So while we've seen that it can be, Red Bull out of the equation relatively fast in Leclerc's hands on a flying lap in qualifying in clean air, it seems that, there's a lot of other issues with that car underlying. And, that is concerning, because those are often the very hard ones to understand, because as much as you can simulate CFD and a wind tunnel to get a car going very quick around one lap, it's very hard to simulate what it's like for a car to be following another car with those tools, and then to also make changes to make the car better, and then not obviously impact on its strengths when it's by itself on a qualifying lap. So there's a lot going on there, and and it's not easy. And again, when you reference it to Red Bull, where everything seems to come so easy, Max Verstappen flying through the field, no problem at all, driving behind other cars. That's where you realize the gap. And again, as we talked about with Mercedes, as I talked about, I'm going to go with Ferrari. The goal was championships. It always is for these top teams. And when you have that realization that that's not the case, I think it really hits the drivers hard, because I was talking to somebody who knows Lewis Hamilton very well in Saudi Arabia. And one of the things he said was that that Lewis goes into these years with a huge amount of preparation all around what it needs to be a champion, be that on himself, mentally, physically, everything. And then when you get to the first race and you realize it's not there, and you've sacrificed so much over the winter to make sure you're in an absolute position to take on anyone who's in a car similar to you and beat them, and then you realize that your car just isn't there, that's a big thing for these drivers to take at this time of season. So we have seen on a number of occasions a few of them just venting a bit of frustration in the media. And then in Lewis's case, he did that in Bahrain and then said that he kind of misspoke a bit when he got to Saudi Arabia. But it is just a sign that these guys are a bit frustrated, knowing that this title is kind of already over for anyone other than Perez and Verstappen.
Thanks for watching ESPN on YouTube. And for more sports highlights and analysis, be sure to download the ESPN app. And for premium content plus live streaming, make sure to subscribe to ESPN Player.